everybody. Assalamualaikum. This is Dino Patti Djalal, founder of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest foreign policy group in Southeast Asia. Today, we are very honored to have a good friend of mine, Mr. Kevin Rudd, who will talk to us about his new book, The Avoidable War. I have it on my Kindle. I've been reading it. It's really a fascinating, insightful book. And I have like 10,000 books on China on my Kindle, and this is definitely the best book that I have ever read on U.S.-China relations. It's written by someone who has a deep knowledge and experience, a practitioner in diplomacy, but also a distinguished academic. Kevin Rudd was Australia's Prime Minister 2007 to 2010 and then 2013. He was Australia's Foreign Minister between 2010 and 2012, and he's now Global President and Chief Executive of the Asia Society in New York since 2015. I have had the pleasure of accompanying my former boss, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who worked very well with Kevin Rudd on many regional and international issues. Welcome, Kevin. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Dino, and salam alaikum. And it's good to be able to talk to all of our friends in Indonesia and Southeast Asia.
Yes. So, Kevin, let's start with the U.S.-China relationship, and then at some point, of course, I want us to talk about the Ukraine war. The book focus on what you would call the U.S.-China managed strategic competition. Can you tell us about it? And do you think that the state of relations between the U.S. and China will be managed well, or what is the potential for it to go out of hand?
Well, thank you, Dino, for the question. The problem that we face is pretty straightforward, and that is that there is, in reality, a strategic competition now between China and the United States for dominance in Asia, and frankly, over time, dominance globally. Certainly that applies economically, it applies militarily, and it applies technologically. It doesn't really matter what each country describes their relationship as. Beneath the surface, this competition is now unfolding in every level. In part, that's because of the changing balance of power between the two countries as China becomes more powerful. And secondly, it's because of the particular leadership posture of Xi Jinping, who's become much more assertive than his predecessors, and therefore has brought about a series of reactions to him by the United States as well. So the question in my mind, Dino, and why I've written this book, is given that there is a strategic competition, do we therefore have one which is unmanaged, that is, no rules of the road, no guardrails, no nothing, and just see what happens? And my concern there, based on history, is the increasing possibility of crisis, conflict, and war between the two of them. Or do you try and bring about some rules for the road, some guardrails which are mutually agreed upon between Washington and Beijing, which reduce the possibility of war and crisis and conflict by accident? That's the central organizing principle of the book. And we can talk more about the operational rules of strategic competition, if you'd like, managed strategic competition, if you'd like. But that's why I've written the book.
Is it possible for US and China to reach strategic accommodation?
Accommodation is perhaps the wrong term, because neither side would accept that term. But I think what you can do is have a jointly agreed structure of managed strategic competition, what I call MSC for short, because it could well be in the national interests of both sides to have it. You see, what I mean by managed strategic competition is just 4 quick things. Number 1 is identify that very small list of strategic red lines between the 2 countries over Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, cyber and space. And identify within those, shall we say, no-go areas, which are mutually agreed at a high level of internal diplomacy between the American and the Chinese side. The second is to have a very wide range of domains in foreign policy, in military modernization, in trade and investment and technology and in talent, and even in the contest of ideas and ideology between American liberal democracy and Chinese-style authoritarian capitalism. And as I said, have non-lethal competition in all those areas, and may the best system win. And then there's a third area, which is still within this framework of managed strategic competition, or MSC. Let's identify those areas where it is in the national interest of each side to continue to collaborate. Climate, the future of pandemics, given they failed to collaborate in the past, and perhaps continued global financial stability, given that that is an ongoing daily challenge. And if there's a fourth element in this overall scheme, Dino, it's this: to have a very simple high-level channel between the US National Security Advisor and his or her Chinese counterpart to be the policeman of this joint strategic framework between them. That's it. That's the logic of it. I hope it secures an audience both in Washington and Beijing, given how difficult things are right now.
President Xi Jinping had talked about the need for a new type of great power relationship. If he reads your book, do you think he will say, Kevin gets what I'm saying, or not exactly? What do you think?
Well, I think the two concepts possibly overlap. If you look carefully at what Xi Jinping meant by 新型大国关系, which is a new type of great power relationship, it was about getting the Americans to agree to Chinese red lines without any effort on the part of the Chinese to get the Americans to agree to American red lines. Mm-hmm. So it was, if you like, if number one, you Americans can agree with our core interests on the South China Sea and on Taiwan, for example, then we are very happy, therefore, to have an open relationship with the United States in all other areas. Now, that's different, if you like, in scope to manage strategic competition, because what I'm seeking to do with managed strategic competition is have the policy elite in both Washington and Beijing have a very direct conversation about these 4 to 5 strategic red lines. And as you know, Dino, as a foreign policy professional, each of the sub-issues within each of them, you can't just say Taiwan. You've got to say, well, what happens if there's a future maritime blockade on Taiwan? What happens if, for example, there is a Taiwanese unilateral declaration of independence? What happens if the Chinese one day decide to salami slice Taiwan by occupying one of Taiwan's small offshore islands? This is the granularity of these individual 5 core strategic red lines that I'm referring to. And secondly, the difference with a new type of great power relationship is this. New type of great power relationship envisaged by Xi Jinping was fully cooperative, so long as the Americans acknowledged China's strategic red lines. Whereas what I'm saying is mutually agree on a framework for managing your strategic red lines, and then have a fully competitive relationship rather than pretending that it's going to be cooperative, but in a non-lethal way.
Yeah, when you talk about competitive relationship, there are 2 possibilities. There's a zero-sum game and there's non-zero-sum game. And the Chinese have argued that, hey, we can compete, but we can do so in a win-win way, win-win fashion. Why is that so difficult to achieve so far on both sides? Yeah. I mean, on the pandemic, both sides are worried about the pandemic and they're helping everybody, but they're not working with each other. And everybody said, hey, if there was the most obvious thing you guys can work on, it should be the pandemic, right? You both have interest in it, yeah.
Well, I agree with you on the pandemic, and it's to all of our collective disadvantage, and I believe to China's disadvantage and to America's disadvantage that they did not. You see, on the Chinese side, it would have been better had the early systems of notification to the World Health Organization and the international community of this outbreak in Wuhan sometime in the period November, December 2019, 2020, that had occurred much earlier, and that domestically China had fully applied the local suppression arrangements they put in place after SARS. Mm-hmm. On the American side, it would have been much better in terms of the availability of the vaccine, whether it's Pfizer or whether it's Moderna or the other variants, including Johnson & Johnson. These mRNA vaccines, if they had been made available at industrial scale for the world, rather than simply in the first instance, the United States. So there have been objective public policy failures on both sides of the pandemic debate. I argue that within managed strategic competition, future global public health challenges should be possible within this framework of competition. And secondly, here is an interesting fact from history, Dino. Even during the Cold War, when the Russians and the Americans were threatening to blow each other's brains out on a regular basis, together they managed to collaborate on the global elimination of cholera. Mm-hmm. That's not a bad thing. So they could still do that in public health while still having a very, very hard-line Cold War relationship. In fact, they had developed some rules of the road. These would be different between China and the United States, but if they can do that during the Cold War, I'm not sure why we couldn't do it now.
Yeah, well, some American friends, when I talk to them, they tend to say, "Hey, you know, we gave China a chance. You know, we lend our hand, we open up to them, but they didn't go our way. They didn't do what we would like them to do." Is this a fair assessment?
Well, the United States and its historical engagement of China has always had a degree of, shall I say, missionary experience.
Yes. Yeah.
But by that I mean the hope initially that China would become fully Christian. That's a 19th century and early 20th century hope. Secondly, that they would then later all become Democrats. And that's the experience with American liberalism in the 20s and 30s. And then since Deng Xiaoping, that they'd all become capitalists and fully participating in international and domestic capitalism. There's a problem with those three missionary expectations, Dino, is that they don't exactly find a huge audience in China itself, even less within the Chinese Communist Party. However, having said that, it's quite true that the Chinese strategy for engaging the international community in the period of reform and opening, 改革开放, after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping returned to the Chinese leadership. Now, that has undergone some internal changes now under Xi Jinping, particularly since the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And what we see increasingly from Xi Jinping is two things. A less emphasis on the market and market reform, and on, shall we say, capitalism with Chinese characteristics within China, and then and the return of the power of the state and state-owned enterprises over private firms. And then secondly, internationally, Xi Jinping now talks about a new pattern of China's opening to the outside world, where China seeks to use what Xi himself calls the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy in order to bring about changes in the international economic and financial system, which would help China. So those two changes have occurred within the Chinese worldview in the last 4 or 5 years under Xi Jinping. And that in part has brought about a series of reactions also from the United States.
Well, I've been we have this China policy group at FPCI, when we used to go every year, except during the pandemic. And I noticed every time we go to China, in the conversations, there was this factor of pride and confidence and Chinese nationalism that is felt in many of our conversations there. But do you think there is the danger that President Xi Jinping, for example, would be overconfident, and that would lead to some mistakes? I think if you see President Putin, that we will talk about later, in launching his invasion of Ukraine, he seems to be displaying a sense of overconfidence that I think is somewhat dangerous.
Well, one of the criticisms of Xi Jinping internally, Dino, is because he has formally abandoned Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy framework of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. As you know, this is a standard phrase in Chinese foreign policy thinking back to the early 80s. And every Chinese diplomat could recite this to you in what was used to be called Deng Xiaoping's diplomatic notes. In other words, the logic was become economically strong first, and until that happens, keep your head down. Instead, in 2014, Xi Jinping formally abandoned that phrase as guidance to the Chinese foreign policy establishment, and instead began to advocate a new approach to foreign policy called 分发有为, which is basically a Chinese expression for a more assertive, activist foreign policy in order to bring about real changes accommodating China's interests and values. So much of the internal criticism within China of Xi Jinping's foreign policy approach was that he abandoned Deng Xiaoping's strategic framework too early, that China was not powerful enough for that to occur, and that Xi Jinping has been too ambitious and too impatient. There's also, secondly, as evidence of that, a parallel criticism of Xi Jinping domestically about him having got too close to the Russians and too close to Vladimir Putin in particular, way out ahead of where the Chinese foreign and security policy establishment would normally be comfortable with. And so there is perhaps an internal critique about Xi Jinping's overconfidence, as you just described it.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, we don't know how long President Xi Jinping will be in power, but is there a chance that history will China's history will see Xi Jinping as bigger than Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong?
I think if you look at the worldview of Xi Jinping, he regards himself as leading a new era in the Chinese Communist Party. He describes that now as being three eras. Number one, the Mao Zedong period, which was the period of China's liberation. The period from, if you like, 1921, when the party was formed, through to 1949. And then the period that followed right through until Mao's death in 1976. The second period is the period when China became more prosperous. That's the Deng period, or the period of reform and opening. But Xi Jinping, since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, has now proclaimed this third period, which is the period where China doesn't just become prosperous, but where it becomes strong. They have three sets of phrases. In the first one, they say, under Mao, China stood up. 中国站起来. Under Deng is when China became prosperous. 中国富起来. And now under Xi, it's when China becomes strong. 中国强起来. And so he sees himself as at least co-equal to Mao and Deng. Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and the others get pushed to one side. But secondly, I think it's fairly clear that in fact he sees himself increasingly as possibly a person who is correcting some of the excesses of the Deng Xiaoping period of market-based reform at home, of the engagement with the international economic system abroad, and of too much foreign policy compromise in terms of China's interests. I think he seeks, therefore, to probably end up with a Chinese political pantheon or hierarchy, which is Mao and Xi. That's where I think the Chinese ideological literature begins to point to.
Do you think President Xi Jinping is a geopolitician? I know a lot of leaders think they are, but not many are. Do you think he is a geopolitician?
I think that if you read carefully what Xi Jinping has written and what he has said, and in terms of his internal audiences within the Chinese Communist Party, he would see himself as a grand strategist. That, of course, includes within it geopolitics. But if you look at his worldview, it is one which he, first of all, uses Marxism-Leninism as his analytical tool for understanding reality. That is, he uses things like dialectical materialism and historical materialism as analytical frameworks to understand where the forces of history are moving, how the Chinese Communist Party can accelerate the forces of history to its advantage, and where the counter forces led by the United States are going. Secondly, he sees himself as a grand strategist who doesn't simply conduct that analysis, but he adjusts Chinese strategy accordingly. Hence the changes that I referred to before, both in his domestic politics, where he's taking the country more to the left, his domestic economic settings, which are going more to the left, but also Chinese nationalism, which he is taking more to the right, underpinning his new assertiveness in foreign policy overall. And therefore, he sees himself as bringing this analysis of great trends together with new strategic directions for the country, domestically and internationally. And then finally, because it's China, and grand strategists seek to do this, they seek to incorporate it within their own, as it were, body of ideological and political works. And this is what's called Xi Jinping thought, Xi Jinping Sisiang, which is now already up to volume 3.
Kevin, everybody's talking about rules-based order now. Countries who use that phrase in many of their speeches now really need to look closely what they mean by a rules-based order. And China had challenged the world order in history, but now seems to be playing a different role. What does a rules-based world order mean to China? Are they a status quo power, or are they a reform world order power? Yeah.
Very much a power committed to changing the order, Dino. I think in terms of the definition of a rules-based order, from the American perspective and from the perspective of its allies and supporters and partners around the world, it incorporates two ideas. One is the series of global institutions led by the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, into a system of institutions, rules, and procedures for managing global governance. The second arm, however, of the US-led global order is the underpinning strategic ballast offered by the regional and global presence of the US military. in order to create a power stability or strategic stability underpinning the rules-based system that we have just referred to. And thirdly, if there's a third element to the rules-based order, it is a limited number of institutions formally outside the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions, and in addition to the underpinning strength of US military power, other institutions which deal with more complex questions of day-to-day global management, such as the G20, of which Indonesia and Australia are members, but also other institutions like the G7. The Chinese critique of the American idea of the global rules-based order is this. They say, this is an American construct. The Chinese say, we believe in the international system. An international system is that anchored only in the UN Charter. Of course, that's where China has the power of veto in the Security Council, and also where China has shares with Russia, if you like, a second power of veto in the Security Council. But China, of course, like all great powers, makes exceptions for itself. Remember, when the Philippines took China to the International Court on the South China Sea, and the determination by the Permanent Court of Arbitration went against China in support of the Philippines case on the 9 dotted lines and rejected the 9 dotted lines, the Chinese automatically rejected the competence and power of the court to make such a determination. Well, that's what you get when you've got a UN system. Sometimes you get decisions which help you, and sometimes you get decisions which don't. I think the other exception is the one which we will probably talk about now, Dino, which is Ukraine. Of course, China says that it upholds the UN Charter. A core principle of the UN Charter is, in their view, in their state-centric view, is mutual non-interference. It's respect for political sovereignty, and it's certainly respect for territorial integrity of other UN member states. Now, clearly, Russia has violated all three of those principles with a full-scale territorial invasion of another sovereign state, Ukraine. However, China in the Security Council and in its own public statements refuses to call it an invasion, refuses to call it as a violation of international law, despite what the UN Charter says in Article 2 about the inviolability of every individual nation state's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. So China, on this second example, finds itself at variance to the principles of the UN system, which it says distinguishes it from the Americans, who have this more complex definition of the global rules-based order.
Well, thank you for mentioning Ukraine. And I want to ask what, just before the Russian invaded Ukraine, President Putin and President Xi Jinping signed a joint declaration that in effect is seen as establishing much closer strategic ties, strategic political and economic ties between Beijing and Moscow. How much should we read into this? Is this just another joint declaration, or is it really a balancing act? Is it really a strategic move of some consequence to the world?
I think it is of strategic consequence. With the Asia Society released what we call an ASPI note, Asia Society Policy Institute note, on the joint strategic declaration of the 4th of February between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, which was issued in Beijing on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics. If you look at the history of Russia-China relations, it's been a very uneven history, and most of it, Dino, adversarial. The Tsarist expansion to the Far East, the forced acquisition of large parts of Chinese territory. Then secondly, the rise of the Soviet Communist Party and the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Soviet Union, through the Comintern, then effectively controlled the Chinese Communist Party for decades. And this led to some tensions between the communist parties. But after Mao won in 1949, at least for the following decade, a very close Sino-Soviet collaboration in building the new China. Thirdly, then we had the Sino-Soviet split between, say, 59 and 89, and border clashes between the two, in part over ideological questions and Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin. And then finally, since 89 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, we've seen this new tentative relationship between post-Soviet Russia and China emerge. Under Xi Jinping in the last decade, it's got much stronger. And the reasons for that is that the Chinese, number one, don't want to have an adversary on their vast northern and northwestern border. Two, they want to be freed strategically to take on their principal regional and global strategic adversary, which is the United States. And three, Russia serves a range of other Chinese strategic interests by distracting the United States in the Middle East and now, as we see, in Europe. And four, Russia's a handy source of commodities in oil, gas, as well as in agricultural commodities. So for those reasons, there is this deepening Russia-China relationship at a structural level. But what Xi Jinping, because of his personal leadership of Chinese foreign policy and being somewhat out ahead of the consensus within his system, has accelerated this level of collaboration even more. And that is what is contained in the joint declaration of 4 February this year, just on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's the document which says there are now no limits to any sphere of strategic collaboration between Moscow and Beijing. It is new, it's big, and I believe it also gave Putin some confidence that China would have his back once he embarked upon his military campaign in Ukraine.
And do you think he's happy with how China has responded since the invasion?
It's difficult for me to assess that, Dino, because I'm not Vladimir Putin's psychologist. And so what makes Mr. Putin happy or sad on a particular day will probably be, frankly, what unfolds on the battlefield in Ukraine. But the Chinese, in the relevant votes in the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly, abstained. They've also been active in international diplomacy, including in Asia, in reducing international support for the democratic worlds and the US-led sanctions regime against Moscow. China has increased or is increasing its purchase of commodities from Russia, but that's not banned in terms of the existing sanctions regime imposed by the United States. But so far, Dino, we have no evidence that China has directly violated financial and military sanctions against Russia, which were imposed as soon as the invasion began. And that's because I think China fears secondary financial sanctions being imposed against it if it was to violate the primary sanctions imposed by the US against Russia because of Ukraine.
One of the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that the West has become much more coherent than before, strategically and politically. I'm just wondering if you think what we are seeing ahead is a world order marked by a hard and permanent strategic contest between Russia and the West.
Well, as you know, President Biden has cast this strategic contest with Russia and its supporters in the authoritarian world as between democracy and autocracy. Now, there'll be a separate debate about the usefulness of that, but what he is seeking to do, in my judgment, is to galvanize the democratic world, and not just in the West, but in other democracies around the world, and ask this question: is it right to support a unilateral action by a nation state to invade the sovereign territory of another? It would have been useful, by the way, if the Americans had reflected on that back in 2003 when they invaded Iraq. But let's just put that into the history basket for the time being. That is the way in which the United States is now categorizing this. But leaving historical double standards to one side, the bottom line is this. This, both in terms of the fact of and the brutality of the Russian military invasion of Ukraine, is becoming a major inflection point in, let's call it, the post-Cold War period. You see, the classical analysis, both by Moscow and Beijing, is that Europe is strategically soft, that it primarily seeks to, quote, make friends through trade. In fact, that's the formal historical German definition of its engagement, both with Moscow and with Beijing. But the reality now is that when you've had a territorial invasion within Europe, and whether you like it or not, and whatever the Russian geographers say, Ukraine is in Europe, then as a consequence of that, this has sent political shockwaves through the complacent strategic communities within Europe to say that there is now a new dividing line. And if you want evidence of this having happened, the best piece of evidence is what has happened with Germany, led by the Social Democrats and Olaf Scholz, announcing a 180-degree shift in its strategy towards Russia, its strategy on its own military expenditure in the future, and a hardline posture in terms of long-term energy dependence on Russia. So this will turn into, in my judgment, a significant fault line in, let's call it, the democratic world's response to this invasion by an authoritarian state.
Yeah. Ironically, do you think this somewhat proved that Trump was right on some counts, dependence on Russian gas, the need for Europe to pay more for its defense, and so on and so on? Do you think Trump is saying, hey, I've been told you so, right?
No, I think Trump was the most dangerous and destabilizing president in American history for this reason, that friends, partners, and allies of the United States could not predict which way the United States would go. You had, for example, a US administration seeking to strengthen its economic footprint in Asia through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then under Trump, repealing the Trans-Pacific Partnership and a free trade agreement with a number of the open economies of East Asia. Secondly, when you also had public disputes with your South Korean allies and your Japanese allies on the cost of US basing arrangements, and similarly with the Europeans, this created enormous fault lines within let me describe it as the democratic alliance structure which the United States has. And then thirdly, I think there was another huge problem with Trump, and that's just his unpredictability in dealing with authoritarian leaders. Like the crazy venture we had with Kim Jong-un and North Korea. What was all that about? Other than, frankly, create a set of foreign policy circumstances where Kim Jong-un was able to have international space to concentrate again on his economy, continue his own weapons development program, and as we've seen most recently through North Korean testing, and through Trump having reached out to Pyongyang, creating the political cover for Xi Jinping to do the same. So there is no longer a divide between China and North Korea. There was before Trump's insane diplomatic intervention, which was driven by Trump's personal ego and not by any sense of real foreign policy or strategic policy strategy. That's why I say Trump was just dangerous for everybody.
Yes. And in the early years of Biden administration, I think they sort of made a decision that, hey, it's not Russia, it's China, which is the real adversary, the real competition. And with the latest development in Ukraine now, do you think the Biden administration has been caught off guard?
I don't believe so. I think if you look at the detail of what the Americans have been doing, Remember, 3 months or more before the Russian invasion on the 25th of February, Dino, the Americans, through their intelligence community briefings to the international media and through their public statements, were warning the world about an impending Russian invasion of Ukraine.
That's true. And nobody believed that at the time. Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's surprising that not many people did, given that if you listen carefully to what Putin has been saying for the last 12 months, where he said that Ukraine is not a state, it's simply part of Russia. And secondly, you put 190,000 troops on the Russian-Ukrainian border. As I said many times, this was not for a Sunday school picnic. This was not for a bit of fun on the beach at Bali. This was because you had a clear strategic intention in mind. But to be fair to the Americans, they warned the international community. Specifically, also, they warned the Chinese this is what Russia was doing. And they asked the Chinese to intervene with Moscow to dissuade them. Secondly, the price of Americans' global strategic leadership is that they have to walk and chew gum at the same time. And that is to manage crises in 2 or 3 theaters simultaneously. Remember, in Ukraine, it's largely a foreign policy and national security challenge because there is no direct involvement by US combatant forces. It's a military supply and logistics question, which the Ukrainians are perfectly entitled to do, given that their territorial integrity has been violated. They can, under international law, request assistance from other states, and they have done that, and other states have complied. So at the same time, what the United States in providing military supplies to the Ukrainians and logistical and intelligence support, none of their assets in the Indo-Pacific region have been depleted or diminished. And the level of American military profiling in our part of the world, Dino, continues to increase. Of course, if you had to face 3 challenges at once, like a further outbreak of instability in the Middle East, that would be challenging. But so far, I think the United States has been managing both these principal challenges of Russia on the one hand and China on the other relatively well.
Kevin, we talk about the geopolitical contests between Russia and the West, and some degree, or to an equal degree, between China and the West. Will this hardened competition and rivalry be brought over to the Indo-Pacific? What is your projection?
I think the fault lines in the Indo-Pacific region, Dina, have already been drawn. And if you like, the fault lines in Europe and the Atlantic are being drawn more clearly because of Ukraine. In the case of the Indo-Pacific, it has been the reality of China's growing military power, the fact that the pattern of its military activities against the Japanese over Senkaku Diaoyudo in the East China Sea, the pattern of its military incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, its ADIZ, the pattern of Chinese island reclamation in the South China Sea, and as you know, the swarming of Chinese naval, customs and fisheries vessels around particular Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea, plus the growth of Chinese dual-use ports across Southeast Asia and South Asia, and not just in Sri Lanka, but also now in Pakistan, and of course in Djibouti, and prospectively on the east coast of Africa. This has been unfolding fairly systematically over the last decade or so. And therefore, for those reasons, it's engendered a reaction. Therefore, you have the Quad, which prior to the Sino-Indian border clash of April, May, June of 2020, was simply a foreign ministers' dialogue mechanism. Now, it is now a much stronger summit-driven, head of government-driven strategic mechanism for pushing back against Chinese power and strategic power and economic power across the Indo-Pacific. Similarly, I think you can probably conceive of AUKUS as having arisen for the same sorts of reasons. As you know, Dino, in international relations and in strategic relations, there are two classic phenomena in the balance of power. One is balancing and the other is bandwagoning. And when you have a changing balance of power between the United States and China, then a number of countries have decided to join with the United States to balance against greater Chinese power. I haven't yet seen a lot of countries bandwagon with China in anticipation that the Chinese will inevitably lead the Indo-Pacific, as it were, strategic order. It's possible. And of course, China does have its friends, Cambodia, Laos, the new military dictatorship in Myanmar, and of course, its all-weather ally in Pakistan, plus the ally that nobody wants, North Korea.
Yes. Before I let our friends from Indonesian universities ask you questions, I want to ask about Russia-China alignment. There are those who believe that this is not sustainable. At some point, their interests will become divergent, and so it's not going to last permanently. What is your view on this?
I always take the view that hope is not a strategy, and that it fails to look at the historical evolution of the Russia-China relationship over the last 30 years. China is doing what it's doing in large part because of its perception of enduring Chinese national security and economic interests. It's not because they suddenly love Russian borscht or they like going to the ballet. On top of those deep national interests, you also have the personal chemistry between the two great authoritarian men of history, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, which, as I said, from a Chinese perspective, institutional perspective, has accelerated and intensified the relationship more than would normally be the case, rather than China maintaining greater reserve, as it did, for example, back in 2014, at the time of the initial Russian invasion of Crimea. However, anyone who thinks that whatever happens in Ukraine, whatever happens in Moscow, and whether the Russian invasion succeeds, fails, or ends up with a frozen conflict in Ukraine, that as a result, the Chinese will abandon their interest in Russia, I think this is just false analysis. They may, in the future, seek to moderate their engagement with Russia, but the idea that this is somehow capable of some American grand strategic move, which brings China back on side in order to deal with the Russian threat and challenge, is strategic nonsense, and people need to be clear about that.
Okay. Well, Kevin, I have the pleasure to inform you that we have 3 students, very bright students, probably future foreign ministers. One is Evelyn from University of Indonesia, Salsabila from University of Gajah Mada, and then Hannah from University of Jenderal Sudirman. And I would like to give them each one question, and you are to ask consecutively. And after all 3 of you have posed your question, Kevin will be glad to answer. And then finally, after that, I will have one last question on the G20 to you, Kevin. Evelyn, you're first. One question only, yeah? Terima kasih.
All right, thank you very much, Pak Dino, for the opportunity. My name is Evelyn from the University of Indonesia, and I would like to say thank you very much. And it's such an honor for me to actually hear your insights and fresh perspective regarding to the emerging issues. So as we've been talking about the China and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I have a question regarding to the China's position in it. As we can perceive, China has tried to play a balancing act in regards to the Ukraine war, which can be shown by calling for peace talks and maximum restraint. On your perspectives, how can China play a constructive role in solving the crisis? I guess that's my question, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Now Salsabila from University of Gajah Mada.
Yes, thank you so much, Dino. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's such an honor for me to be in this discussion room. My name is Salsabila from University of Gajah Mada. So I think we already touched upon the issue of the accelerated cooperation between Russia and China. And I just want to ask, in your opinion, do you think the Russia-China strategic alignment will deliver further tension between Russia, China, and the West and certain strategic issues such as in the political status of Taiwan, the South China Sea, or the Kuril Island dispute? That would be all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salsabila. And Hana from University of Jenderal Sudirman.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Dr. Dino. My name is Hana from Jenderal Sudirman University. Regarding the Russian invasion in Ukraine, does China currently see Russia more as a liability, or do they still see Russia as a reliable economic partner? That would be all for me. Thank you.
Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the 3 questions. And I congratulate you on your studies, and I wish you every success in what you do in your academic and policy careers in the future. On the question of Chinese mediation, let me put it in these terms. China at this stage has been unprepared to mediate because it fears alienating its friends in Moscow. Secondly, they would have to ask themselves, mediate about what? Certainly a ceasefire, but beyond that, they would not wish to undermine Putin's interests. And thirdly, so far, they have refused to initiate head of government level contact between Xi Jinping and President Zelensky of Ukraine. My anticipation is that on the mediation question is that if Putin continues to fare badly militarily, and we are moving slowly towards a military stalemate, perhaps the Chinese at 1 minute to midnight will seek to intervene in order to be seen to be organizing or mediating a ceasefire, partly designed for their domestic public opinion, which is more divided on Russia and Ukraine than we think, and partly to appease the Europeans. But at this stage, there has been no substantive role played, despite the fact that President Zelensky last week asked the Chinese to use their good offices with Moscow to bring about a ceasefire and a Russian withdrawal. On the second question which was raised, which was the emergence of this de facto Russia-China alliance and its impact on East Asian security from the Kuril Islands through to the South China Sea. I think the division of labor between Moscow and Beijing has been along these lines, that in Europe and the Atlantic and the Middle East, Russia takes the lead and supported by the Chinese politically and diplomatically. And in the Indo-Pacific, China takes the lead, supported by the Russians politically and diplomatically. However, the idea that the Russians would directly militarily engage in support of Chinese positions, security positions in East Asia, I think at this stage is a bridge too far for Moscow to consider. The one exception to that is if we had a sudden flare-up, of course, on the Kuril Islands. As you know, the Russians have suspended their long-standing negotiations with the Japanese to bring about a peace treaty, which would seek to return the 4 northern territories, which are currently under Russian control, back to Japanese sovereignty. It's possible, but not probable, that there could be some security concerns there. But I would think that the Chinese would themselves be reluctant to encourage the Russians to take a more belligerent position militarily against Japan. China does not at this stage want to see the possibility of open armed conflict in East Asia and the West Pacific. And the reason is China is not yet militarily or financially prepared for that. By the end of this decade, maybe. So that is my attempted answer at the second question. Dino, can you help me remember the third one?
Hannah, you want to repeat your question again, Hannah?
Yes. regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, does China currently see Russia more as a liability, or do they still see Russia as a reliable economic partner?
I think overall, Hannah, it's still a very long-term strategic view in Beijing that they see Russia as a useful and reliable partner. If you're sitting in Beijing, you don't have many reliable partners in the world. Pyongyang in North Korea is a liability. Pakistan is a partner, but it produces enormous collateral complications for the Chinese in their dealing with India, as evidenced most recently in the visit by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi to meet with Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Minister, where both the Sino-Indian border and Pakistan continue to arise. Therefore, when you look elsewhere in the world, the only other significant country, apart from perhaps Venezuela, that the Chinese have a deep relationship with, in Cuba, is the Russian Federation itself. So I do not see China walking away from Russia at all. It's still advantageous to China, and the problems caused by that relationship now because of Putin's overreach in Ukraine will be seen as unhelpful, but certainly not terminal in terms of China's long-standing interests in the Russian relationship. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Hannah, Salsa, and Evelyn. Kevin, I want to ask you about the G20. As you know, Indonesia is the president of G20 this year. And I don't know if many people know this, but you have two babies in the region, Kevin, right? One of the baby is called East Asia Summit. And I know you are one of the fathers because you began talking about the Pacific community. Some people or many people were skeptical about it, but East Asia Summit is what you had in mind, although it's different in name. Yeah. But the second thing, and again, not many people know about this, is the G20. And I know because I was there and you were there as a Prime Minister of Australia. I remember the phone calls that I had to connect between our leaders back and forth because after the financial crisis or during the financial crisis, there were different possibilities. G20 was not preordained. There was a model of G11 or a G13 and so on. And you and President Yudhoyono at the time were pressed on for the G20 format. And I remember a call that we had to make to President Bush. I think it was a trilateral call where President Bush agreed, yeah, let's do a G20, not G11 or 13. So two questions for you. Why did you insist on the G20 rather than the G11 or the G13? And now that you look at the G20 now, what is your reflection? Are you happy with how it has turned out and what needs to be done in order to make it stronger?
Yeah, the reason we went for a G20, Dino, and SBY, myself, and others worked hard with Washington to make sure it was a G20 and not a G12 was simply this. We believe that if you're looking at the 21st century, you needed a much better and bigger balance between the Europeans and the emerging economies of Asia, as well as a greater representation from the Americas. And so the problem with a G12 was it would have excluded Indonesia, it would have excluded the Republic of Korea, it would have excluded Australia, and in the Americas, it would have excluded Mexico, it would have excluded possibly Brazil as well. And for those reasons, and in Europe, it would have excluded Turkey, and it would have excluded certainly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. My argument at the time was that we needed to have a future institution for global financial and economic governance, which represented the emerging major economies for the century. And secondly, it should be balanced across the continents. And thirdly, balanced across, frankly, the traditions. it would be, for example, the first time that we had 3 countries from the Muslim world in the G20, in terms of the Saudis, the Turks, as well as Indonesia, of course. And this made, in my judgment, a better balance. On the final question you asked, which is what's my reflection over the last decade or so, I believe we could have done better. I think the G20 was not fully and early mobilized by the Americans in response to the eruption of the COVID crisis. The G20 was perfectly positioned to handle both the public health as well as the economic recovery challenges alive within the world at the time. So I think, frankly, given how quickly we gathered as a G20 to deal with the global financial crisis, I would have hoped that we could have done the same in early 2020 to deal with the pandemic and the associated economic crisis as well. So the lesson for the future is the machinery exists, but it must be used and deployed. And the Americans must, behind the rotating chair, because they still are the world's largest economy, they must be prepared to deploy the machinery as well. And so that's what I would like to see happen this year.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I wish we could have another hour, but time goes by really fast when we have a rich discussion. I want to congratulate you on your book, The Unavoidable War. If you have only one foreign policy book to read for the year, I would recommend this book to you. I want to thank all our listeners for joining in. I want to thank Salsa, Bila, Hannah, and Evelyn for your questions and for your love of foreign policy. And most of all, I want to thank Kevin Rudd. He is a man, as Prime Minister or as just a common man, he's just the same person, right? So that's what I admire about him. He's just inspiring, but also very humble. So thank you very much, Kevin. I hope you will have your book translated into Bahasa, and FPCI will be happy to work with you on that, because I think it's many of our students and the public need to read the analysis in your book. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Dino. And, all the best to the foreign policy community of Indonesia. And thank you for the idea of putting the book into Bahasa. And terima kasih. And I look forward to seeing you in Jakarta soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye, Kevin.
All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Salsa, Hannah, Evelyn. Yeah.